My name is Corinne Wallace, and what I'm about to share with you is a true story. It's not one of those tales you hear from a friend of a friend. It's my life, my family, and the night everything changed. Before I even dive into it, let me ask you something simple. If you love your children or grandchildren, drop a heart emoji in the comments or just write the word love. And let me know where you're watching from. It helps me see how many of us, as parents and grandparents, carry the same kind of battles in silence until a moment forces us to act. Now let me start at the beginning. I didn't plan a grand entrance on my daughter Selah's 30th birthday. Truth be told, I hadn't been invited at all. Over the years, our relationship had been stretched thin, bruised by words and choices that never should have been made. Selah believed I interfered too much, that I always had an opinion about her marriage. Sometimes she would go weeks without returning my calls. Once, she even told me to stop visiting unless I was asked. And the most painful part. She did all this not because she wanted distance from me, but because she wanted peace with her husband. Selah's loyalty to Darius came at my expense. She thought by pushing me away, she could hold her marriage together. I swallowed the pain each time, choosing silence over making her life harder. But silence does not erase the ache in a mother's chest. As the milestone birthday approached, I thought about what it meant. 30 is not just another number, it's the threshold of adulthood, of identity, of settling into who you are. And I thought to myself, maybe this was my chance to mend things. Surprise visit. A cake, some flowers, and a handwritten card I poured my heart into. I didn't know what reception awaited me, but I believed a mother's love was always worth the risk. That afternoon I drove across town. I didn't want to park right in front of the house. I wanted the moment to be genuine, unexpected. I tucked the cake under my arm, smoothed the wrinkles out of my dress, and rehearsed in my mind what I would say. Happy birthday, Selah. I know we've had our differences, but today I just want to celebrate you. I can still remember the feeling as I stepped onto her porch. The air was sharp, and I could hear laughter spilling from inside. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe everything might be normal, that I would walk into a room filled with joy and see my daughter smiling. But life has a way of shattering illusions at the very moment you cling to them. The door wasn't locked. I turned the knob gently and stepped inside. What I saw froze me where I stood. The moment I stepped through that door, I realized this wasn't a birthday celebration. It was a nightmare disguised in balloons and ribbons. My eyes locked first on Selah. Her hair was neatly styled, her dress pressed, but none of that masked the swollen cheek and trembling hands. I had never seen her look so small, so broken. And there, towering over her, was Darius. His hand raised again as though striking her was his God-given right. The crack of his palm against her face still rings in my ears. Selah stumbled backward, catching herself on the edge of the table. Ava's sobs cut through the air, high-pitched, frantic, the kind of cry a child makes when they've seen too much for their young heart to understand. She pressed her little palms against her ears as if trying to block out the violence, but her tears only flowed harder. And then my eyes shifted to the others, the people who were supposed to be family. Darius's parents sat comfortably on the couch, as if front-row seats to their son's cruelty were entertainment. His mother smirked, whispering something into his father's ear that drew a chuckle. His brother, leaning against the wall, had his phone raised, recording like it was some cheap spectacle. Their laughter wasn't just cruel, it was inhuman. They weren't watching their son destroy his marriage. They were enjoying it. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse racing. My instinct was to rush forward, to grab him, to shield Selah and Ava. But I knew that kind of chaos would only escalate what was already happening. So instead I reached into my purse. My hands shook, but my mind was steady. I pulled out my phone and lifted it. The sharp click of the camera shutter cut through the noise like thunder. The room went silent. Darius turned, his smirk frozen on his lips. He hadn't expected me. He hadn't even known I was there. His eyes widened, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw his confidence falter. I walked forward, slow and deliberate. The phone was still in my hand, the evidence secure, but it was my eyes that carried the real weight. I locked them on his and stepped close enough that he couldn't escape the force of my words. My voice was low but unshaken, every syllable deliberate. You are doomed. 3 words. Nothing more. But in that moment, they were heavier than any fist, sharper than any blade. His smirk vanished completely. He tried to laugh it off, to shrug as though I were just a meddling mother. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted back and forth, searching for a way to erase what had just happened. The tension was suffocating. Selah stood frozen, torn between shame and desperation, her body trembling from the blows. Ava's cries softened into hiccups as she clung to her mother's leg. And still, not a single one of Darius's relatives spoke. Their laughter had evaporated, replaced by a silence thick with unease. I turned from him and walked toward my daughter. My free hand reached out, steadying her as though she were still that little girl I once carried on my hip. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, searched mine as though asking permission to leave. I gave a small nod, and she understood. I bent down to scoop Ava into my arms. Her tiny frame shook as she buried her face against my shoulder. The smell of her strawberry shampoo, the dampness of her tears, it was all I needed to remind me why I had to be strong. With Selah on one side and Ava in my arms, I turned back toward the door. I didn't rush. I didn't plead. I walked slowly, each step echoing louder than the last. No one dared stop me. Not Darius, not his smirking parents, not his brother with a phone. They all stood frozen in the gravity of what had just been said and done. We stepped outside into the evening air, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I took a full breath. The door closed behind us, shutting out their laughter, their cruelty, their arrogance. That was the moment the tide turned. In the silence of that walk to my car, with Selah limping beside me and Ava clinging to my neck, I knew the picture on my phone and the 3 words I had spoken would unravel everything Darius thought he had built. His house of control, his false pride, his family's poisonous laughter. All of it was about to collapse. He didn't know it yet. But from the second I whispered those words, his fate was sealed. It wasn't always like this between me and my daughter. When Selah was growing up, we were inseparable. She was my firstborn, my joy, the child who made me a mother. I worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and still found time to braid her hair, sit at her school plays, and cheer her through every milestone. For years, I believed no bond could come between us. But time, love, and pride have a way of reshaping even the strongest relationships. The trouble began when she met Darius. He was charming at first glance, the kind of man who seemed polite to mothers and protective of daughters. I wanted to believe he was a good choice for her, but there was always something in his eyes that unsettled me. Too sharp, too hungry for control. When I raised quiet concerns, Selah brushed them off, saying I was overreacting. She accused me of never thinking anyone was good enough for her. First, I let it go. I didn't want to be the mother who stood in the way of her daughter's happiness. But soon, the changes in Selah became harder to ignore. She stopped calling me as often. She no longer shared the details of her life with the same openness as before. When she did, it was often with Darius's voice hovering in the background, as if she was performing for his approval. On the rare occasions we sat down together, our conversations would spiral into arguments. She accused me of being too much, too opinionated, too protective, too unwilling to accept her husband's authority. I remember the sting of those words, the way they cut deeper than she realized. One evening, the divide became painfully clear. Darius had lost his job, and Selah confided in me that she had been paying the bills on her own for months. I told her gently that she needed to be careful, that love was not supposed to feel like being drained dry. Instead of listening, she lashed out. She said I didn't respect her marriage, that I was trying to plant seeds of doubt between her and her husband. That was the night she told me not to come by the house without calling first. It didn't stop there. Months later, when I tried to visit and drop off groceries, Darius met me at the door and told me Selah was too busy. I could see her shadow in the hallway behind him, but she never came forward. I left those bags on the porch and drove away with tears in my eyes. Later, Selah called and told me I embarrassed her, that I made things worse between her and her husband. The more I tried to help, the more she pushed me away. The worst moment came when Ava was born. My heart swelled the day I held my granddaughter for the first time. I thought surely this would bring us closer again. But soon after, Selah stopped letting me watch the baby. She said Darius felt I was interfering too much, questioning how they ran their household. It hurt in ways I cannot fully describe, being treated like an outsider in the very life I helped her build. More than once, I asked myself if I should just let go, stop calling, stop reaching out. But no matter how deep the distance grew, I could never stop being her mother. That's why my visit on her 30th birthday was so unexpected. By then, Selah had grown comfortable keeping me at arm's length. She didn't think I needed to be there. Truthfully, part of me believed she didn't even want me there. But a mother's intuition is stronger than pride. Something told me that day would matter. Something told me to show up anyway. Looking back now, I realize how close I came to missing it all, to missing the chance to protect her and my granddaughter. If I had let my pride win, if I had stayed home telling myself that Selah no longer needed me, she would have faced that nightmare alone. Instead, I stepped into the house at the exact moment the truth revealed itself. I became not just her mother that day, but her savior. And that is why the scene I walked into cut me so deeply. It wasn't just about watching Darius strike her. It was about realizing how far Selah had fallen into his control, how much she had sacrificed trying to prove me wrong, and how blind she had been to the danger all along. The fractures in our relationship suddenly made sense. They weren't about her not loving me. They were about her trying to survive under the weight of a man who demanded her loyalty at any cost. The irony is sharp. She once thought I was too much. But in that living room, as Darius raised his hand against her and his family laughed, she learned I wasn't nearly enough. Not until I showed up uninvited, holding nothing but a cake, some flowers, and the kind of love that refuses to die. After that night, once the shock had settled into something colder, resolve, I began asking Selah questions she had avoided for years. The truth she shared only deepened the betrayal, layer by layer. That house, the one I had just walked into, the one where balloons and broken laughter still clung to the walls, was not Darius's home. It was Selah's. Every brick, every payment, every nail that held it together. She had bought it with her own sweat. Back when they first got married, Selah had been the one with stable income and a steady savings account. She had worked long hours, sacrificing vacations and luxuries to set aside enough for a down payment. Her dream had always been to provide security for her daughter, a roof over their heads that no landlord could take away. Darius came into the marriage with charm and promises but little else. His job was shaky, his credit riddled with red marks, and his ambition stretched no further than appearances. Still, Selah believed in building a life with him. So when it came time to sign the papers, It was her name alone on the deed. She didn't tell me this at the time. I only learned it later. She thought keeping the details quiet would avoid arguments, especially since Darius had a fragile pride. But pride doesn't pay mortgages, and pride doesn't build homes. Selah did. And yet, within those walls, she was treated like a tenant. Darius strutted through the halls as though it was his domain, enforcing rules, dictating how money should be spent, and demanding obedience not only from Selah but also from Ava. What made it worse was how his family benefited from it all. His parents moved in whenever they pleased, eating from Selah's kitchen, lounging on her furniture, running up her bills. His siblings would come and go, borrowing money, driving her car, and leaving messes behind. They acted like royalty in a kingdom Selah had built. Selah tried to make peace with it. For years, she told herself this was marriage, that compromise meant giving more than you took. She silenced herself whenever Darius barked about finances. She gave up saying no when his family treated her house like theirs. And she convinced herself that defending her own boundaries would only break her marriage apart. The cruel irony is that the more she gave, the more they despised her. They saw her sacrifices not as love, but as weakness. Darius demanded that she funnel her income into his family's needs. Loans for his father's failed business, hospital bills for his mother, even tuition for a cousin she barely knew. Each time Selah hesitated, each time she dared to remind him that she worked hard for her money, the tension grew. And every time she resisted, he punished her. Through silence, through anger, through his fists. What struck me hardest was this. She had been paying not only for the house but for nearly everything else too. The utilities, the groceries, Ava's clothes and school supplies. It all came from Selah's paycheck. Darius's income, small and inconsistent, was often swallowed by his own habits and his family's endless demands. And yet, he never allowed her to feel any pride in what she had achieved. He twisted her success into debt, her generosity into obligation, her independence into submission. Listening to her, I felt rage bubbling inside me. How could a man live in a house bought by his wife, watch her provide for his child, and still treat her like nothing more than a servant? How could his family lounge in her living room, eating food she paid for, while mocking her pain? It was parasitism, plain and simple, dressed up as marriage. This was more than domestic cruelty. It was theft hidden under a wedding band. And that's why the photograph mattered so much. It wasn't just proof of violence, it was proof of the rot underneath. When I looked back at the image later, what I saw wasn't just a man striking his wife. I saw a man standing in a home he didn't own, surrounded by people who lived off a woman they despised, laughing as though her suffering was their inheritance. That single picture didn't just capture an act of abuse. It captured an empire of lies built on Selah's back. From that moment on, I knew the fight ahead wasn't just about bruises or broken trust. It was about reclaiming what was hers. Selah didn't just need freedom from Darius. She needed to take back her house, her money, her dignity, and the very foundation of her life. Because as long as he held control within those walls, she would never truly be free. The drive away from that house was silent. Selah sat in the passenger seat, her body trembling, her cheek already beginning to swell. Ava lay curled against her mother's chest, thumb in her mouth, eyes wide and fearful. Every now and then, Selah tried to wipe her daughter's tears, but her own kept spilling over. I didn't push her to speak. I just drove, gripping the wheel tighter than I ever had in my life, each mile putting more distance between us and that nightmare. When we finally reached my apartment, Selah collapsed onto the couch, her shoulders shaking under the weight of what she had just endured. For the first time in years, she didn't try to defend Darius. She didn't tell me I was overreacting or accuse me of stirring trouble. Instead, she whispered words that broke my heart. "Mama, it's been going on for years." I sat across from her, stunned as the truth poured out. The insults, the bruises, the way Darius used money as a weapon. The countless times his family encouraged him, telling him Selah needed to be kept in line. She told me how she would hide makeup in her purse to cover the marks before work, how she stopped inviting friends over because the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. She admitted that her silence was partly pride and partly fear. Pride in not wanting to prove me right, and fear that if she spoke up, Darius would only make things worse. Listening to her confession, I felt anger rise in me like fire. But anger alone doesn't protect a daughter and her child. Strategy does. And that night, strategy became my language. I pulled out my phone and opened the photograph I had taken. The image was raw, undeniable. Darius's hand mid-strike, Selah recoiling, Ava crying, and his family in the background laughing. It was the kind of evidence no lawyer could dismiss, no judge could ignore. But I didn't stop there. I asked Selah to roll up her sleeves, and sure enough, the bruises told their own story. Some were fresh, others fading. Proof that this wasn't a single incident but a pattern of abuse. I photographed them all, time-stamped every image, and stored them carefully. Then I went into the kitchen and pulled out a notebook. While Selah held Ava, I began listing everything she told me. Dates, incidents, threats, even the details about money. I had learned long ago that people like Darius thrive in shadows, where silence is their ally. My plan was simple. Drag everything into the light. Selah's voice shook as she recounted how Darius would demand her paycheck, insisting his family needed help. How he once withheld the car keys for a week when she refused to sign a loan agreement. How his mother would laugh and tell her to know her place. Every word was fuel for the fire I was building. By the end of the night, I had more than just a collection of wounds and a single photograph. I had the beginnings of a case. But beyond paperwork and evidence, I also began planning the immediate steps. Selah and Ava weren't going back there. Not to spend a night, not to collect belongings, not for anything. I told her plainly, "You and your daughter are safe here until this is over." I would help her file reports. I would help her reclaim her house. And I would make sure Darius never had the power to raise his hand against her again. Selah nodded slowly, but the shame in her eyes lingered. "I should have listened to you years ago," she whispered. I didn't scold her. I didn't tell her I'd been right all along. I just placed my hand over hers and said, "What matters is that you're here now. And you're not facing this alone." That night was the breaking point, but it was also the start of something new. For years, Darius had controlled her through silence and fear. But with one photograph, one notebook, and one mother who refused to be pushed aside any longer, the tables began to turn. The escape wasn't just physical, it was the first strike of revenge. Because I knew something Darius didn't. Once a mother decides to fight, there is no power on earth strong enough to stop her. In the days that followed their escape, I began piecing together the paper trail of Selah's life with Darius. Abuse leaves scars on the body, but financial control leaves chains on the soul, and those chains, I discovered, were wrapped tightly around my daughter. Selah hesitated at first when I asked for her bank records. Years of being humiliated about money had trained her to feel ashamed even of her own success. But I reminded her, abuse thrives in secrecy. We had already pulled back the curtain on his violence. Now it was time to expose his theft. Finally, she handed me a stack of documents she had kept hidden in a drawer, afraid to even look at them herself. The pattern was clear from the very first page. Every paycheck Selah brought home went straight into a joint account, one Darius insisted on managing. From there, withdrawals bled steadily into his family's pockets. A loan repayment to his father that never ended. Regular cash transfers labeled utilities that were far higher than the actual bills. Even credit card charges from luxury items Selah never bought. Designer shoes, electronics, nights out, that all pointed back to Darius and his freeloading siblings. The more I read, the angrier I became. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was financial abuse, calculated and deliberate. Darius had positioned himself as the gatekeeper of her own earnings, controlling when and how she could spend. If she asked about a withdrawal, he accused her of being selfish. If she refused to sign off on a loan, he punished her with days of cold silence or worse. Every decision she made was filtered through his temper, and over time she stopped fighting. One entry in particular made my blood boil. A large withdrawal marked investment, money Selah had been saving for Ava's future, was transferred directly into his cousin's failing business. Weeks later, when she questioned him, Darius told her she was ungrateful for not supporting his family. That money, her money, was gone, swallowed by another man's debts, while Selah was left scrambling to pay for diapers and groceries. And then came the property records. I pulled the deed on her house from the county clerk's office, and just as Selah had admitted, her name was the only one listed. It was her house, her purchase, her investment. Yet Darius strutted around telling neighbors it was their home, boasting to his family about what he had built. Behind closed doors, he treated Selah like a squatter in her own living room, reminding her that as his wife, everything she owned was his by right. I laid all the documents out on the table. Bank statements, property deeds, loan agreements, and Selah sat across from me, tears welling in her eyes. She had been carrying this weight for so long that she no longer recognized it as abuse. To her it had just become life. But now, with everything spread out in black and white, the manipulation was undeniable. "You've been financing them," I said softly. "Every single one of them. And they've been laughing at you while doing it." Selah's shoulders slumped, as if the air had left her body. She whispered that sometimes she wondered if Darius even loved her at all, or if she was just a bank account he had married. It was a question no woman should ever have to ask. That was the moment my resolve hardened further. I wasn't just going to protect my daughter physically. I was going to dismantle every thread of control he had woven around her. The bruises would heal, but the financial stranglehold had to be broken permanently. I began drafting a plan. First, we would separate her accounts. No more joint access, no more free pipeline into her earnings. Next, we would document every questionable transfer, every suspicious loan, and every fraudulent signature. I wanted a trail so strong that not even the slickest lawyer could wiggle him out of it. And finally, we would make sure the court saw him not just as an abusive husband, but as a parasite who leached off his wife while parading as a provider. The more I uncovered, the more disgusted I became. Here was a man who had contributed little, who had lived in a house he did not own, eaten food he did not pay for, and clothed himself in luxuries bought with someone else's labor, yet still found room to raise his hand against the very woman keeping him afloat. That is not a husband. That is a thief with a wedding ring. And as I sat at my table, staring at the mountain of evidence, one thought played over and over in my mind. He believed he had Selah trapped. But soon he would learn the truth. The chains he had wrapped around her were already in my hands, and I was about to use them to strangle his entire empire. I thought I had seen the worst of Darius's deceit when I laid out the financial records. But sometimes, the surface betrayal is only a shadow of what lies beneath. The more I dug, the more twisted his web became, and what I uncovered next nearly broke Selah all over again. It began with a series of withdrawals I couldn't make sense of. They weren't large like the ones for his cousin's business, but they were steady, regular, and always funneled into the same account under a name Selah didn't recognize. At first, she assumed it was another one of his family's endless needs. But when I traced the account, the truth snapped into focus. The money was going to a woman. And not just any woman. She lived in a nearby neighborhood, close enough that Darius could have driven there in under 20 minutes. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the consistency of the payments told its own story. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a loan. It was support. And when I confronted Selah with the findings, her face went pale. She admitted there had always been whispers, strange phone calls late at night, unexplained absences, and an argument years back when she found a text message from a woman saved under a fake name. Darius had laughed it off, saying she was paranoid, that she needed to trust her man. And Selah, desperate to prove she wasn't the kind of wife who nagged or doubted, let it go. But whispers have a way of becoming truth. And this one came with living, breathing proof. The woman's name appeared again in a file I pulled later, tied to a child support inquiry that had quietly been dismissed when payments resumed. A child, a boy, born just a year after Ava. The dates lined up too neatly to be coincidence. And then came the final piece. A paternity record that left no room for denial. Darius wasn't just unfaithful. He was living a double life, supporting a child outside his marriage while draining Selah to keep it hidden. When I showed Selah the documents, she broke. She buried her face in her hands, shaking her head, whispering, "Mama, I was just a pawn." Tears slid through her fingers as she realized the truth, that her years of sacrifice weren't for the sake of her marriage, but to keep another woman and child comfortable, with her own husband's family in on the scheme. Because that was the cruelest part. His parents knew. The same people who laughed in that living room while he struck Selah had been quietly funneling money to the child's mother for years. They had encouraged Darius to stay married, not out of love for Selah, but because she was their golden goose. Her paycheck fed 2 households, 2 families, while she was made to feel like a servant in her own home. The betrayal was staggering. Selah had been manipulated not only by her husband but by his entire family. Every smile, every polite word they had ever given her had been a mask, covering the fact that they saw her not as a wife or daughter-in-law, but as a resource to be drained. For me, this revelation was more than another wound. It was a weapon. Abuse cases are often twisted in court, with abusers painting themselves as misunderstood husbands or victims of marital disagreements. But this was indisputable. It painted a picture of a man who wasn't just violent, but deceitful, parasitic, and unfaithful. It showed a family that wasn't just complicit, but actively exploiting Selah. And it provided a motive that no one could ignore. Money. I tucked the evidence into my growing file. The photograph, the bruises, the bank records, the property deed. And now, the proof of infidelity and a secret child. Piece by piece, I was building a case so strong it would crush not just Darius but the fortress his family thought they had built around him. Selah, though shattered, found a strange strength in the discovery. "All these years," she whispered, "I thought I was failing as a wife. But it was never about me, was it?" I squeezed her hand. "No, baby. It was about what they could take from you." And in that moment, I made a silent vow. If Darius thought his secret child would stay hidden, if his parents thought their laughter and manipulation would protect him, they were wrong. This truth would not stay buried. It would be the blade that sliced through every lie they had built. Darius had thought he was untouchable. But now I had enough to prove not just his abuse, but his betrayal, his theft, and his double life. The walls of his empire were beginning to crumble, and soon the world would see him for what he truly was. A parasite, a coward, and a man who was, as I had already told him, doomed. By the time I had gathered the evidence of bruises, bank records, and the secret child, I knew we had more than just family drama. We had a case, one strong enough to dismantle Darius from the inside out. The question wasn't whether to act, but how quickly and carefully to move. The first step was the police. That very week, I drove Selah to the precinct. She sat in the passenger seat in silence, staring out the window, her hands clenched in her lap. Ava was with a trusted neighbor. I didn't want her anywhere near the trauma of reliving what she'd already witnessed. When we walked into the station, Selah hesitated at the door. Years of being silenced made her unsure if her voice would matter now. I slipped my hand into hers and whispered, "It starts here." Inside, the officer listened as Selah spoke in a trembling voice. She described the abuse, the years of control, the night of her birthday when the violence played out in front of her child. I watched as her words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, the truth pouring from her like water breaking through a dam. When her voice faltered, I produced the photograph. The officer leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he studied it. There was no mistaking the raised hand, the look of fear on Selah's face, the tears streaming down Ava's cheeks, and the chilling laughter of Darius's family in the background. It was not just an accusation, it was proof. The officer immediately referred her to the domestic violence unit. From there, the process became methodical. They photographed Selah's injuries, each bruise documented with timestamps. Medical records were ordered to confirm the pattern of abuse. They opened an incident file, and with every form filled, Selah's fear gave way to a quiet strength. But I wasn't finished. I pushed her to file with Child Protective Services as well. Ava had been a witness to violence far too young, and the law takes that seriously. At first, Selah resisted. She worried it might make her look like a negligent mother. I reminded her, "You didn't fail her. He did. And the system needs to see that." Reluctantly, she agreed. In that small office, she described how Ava cried whenever Darius raised his voice, how she would run to her mother's arms when arguments began. Every detail built a clearer picture. This wasn't just a marriage falling apart. It was a child growing up in an environment poisoned by fear. I compiled the financial records next. I printed out bank statements, highlighting suspicious transfers. I attached the property deed showing Selah as sole owner of the house. I documented the regular payments to the woman tied to Darius's secret child, along with the paternity evidence I had uncovered. It wasn't only a case of domestic abuse anymore. It was fraud, financial exploitation, and betrayal woven together. Piece by piece, I assembled everything into a binder. On the front cover I taped a copy of the photograph because that image was the heart of it all. Whenever Darius tried to deny, whenever his family tried to twist the narrative, that picture would stand as silent testimony against him. It wasn't easy for Selah. Every appointment, every statement, forced her to relive the years she had tried so hard to bury. But I kept reminding her that this was the path to freedom, not just for her but for Ava too. And as difficult as it was, I saw a change in her. With every signature, with every recorded testimony, she grew stronger. She was no longer just a victim. She was a mother reclaiming her life. By the end of that month, we had a case file thicker than most criminal indictments. Police reports, medical evidence, child services documentation, financial fraud records, and proof of infidelity. No part of Darius's life was untouched. His fists, his lies, his theft, his double life, they were all laid bare. And as I closed that binder, I thought back to the moment in his living room when I whispered 3 words. "You are doomed." At the time it was a warning. Now it was prophecy. Word travels faster than paper trails. By the time the police reports were filed and the first subpoenas issued, whispers had already begun spreading through the neighborhood. The laughter that once spilled from Darius's porch grew quieter, replaced by drawn curtains and hushed conversations. Neighbors who had once waved without question now gave side glances, curiosity and suspicion simmering in their eyes. Darius felt the pressure immediately. He showed up at Selah's workplace one afternoon, storming through the parking lot as if intimidation alone could rewrite the truth. His voice was loud enough for her co-workers to hear, calling her a liar, accusing her of trying to ruin him. Selah told me later her hands shook as she walked past him, refusing to engage. What he didn't realize was that his outburst only confirmed the rumors. Every raised word, every wild accusation painted him exactly as the man we were exposing. That evening, his anger turned toward me. I came home to find him leaning against my apartment building, arms crossed, a smirk painted across his face. When I tried to walk past, he stepped into my path. "You think you're clever," he hissed, low enough for only me to hear. "But you've made a mistake getting in my business. You'll regret it." I didn't flinch. I held his gaze the same way I had the night I snapped that photograph, and I said nothing. Silence can be more unnerving than 1,000 shouted words. His smirk wavered just for a second before he backed away. I walked past him with my head high, not because I wasn't afraid. I was, but because fear was the reaction he wanted most. I refused to give it to him. The momentum was shifting, and he knew it. His calls to Selah grew more desperate, alternating between pleading and threatening. One night he promised he would change, begging her to come home. The next, he threatened to take Ava away from her, claiming she was poisoning their daughter against him. But the more he tried to regain control, the more he revealed how little he had left. Selah refused his calls, her resolve hardening every day she spent under my roof. His family, once so bold, began to show cracks as well. His mother avoided eye contact at the grocery store. His father, who used to boast about his son the provider, now muttered excuses when confronted by old friends. Even his brother, the one who had filmed that night in the living room, deleted his social media accounts when the whispers about the video reached the edges of their circle. The fortress they thought was impenetrable was crumbling. One rumor, one piece of evidence, one act of defiance at a time. But what unsettled Darius most wasn't the police, the courts, or the neighbors. It was me. Every time he tried to intimidate, I remained calm. Every time he barked threats, I answered with silence. I had no need to raise my voice. The binder of evidence spoke louder than I ever could. And in his eyes I saw the shift. The man who once mocked me as too much, now recognized me as the immovable wall standing between him and my daughter. One night, Selah asked me how I managed to stay so calm when he confronted me. I told her the truth. Because he's already finished. He just doesn't know it yet. The cracks in his fortress weren't just external. They were inside him too. The fear that had flickered in his eyes when I first whispered "You are doomed" was now a fire spreading through every part of his life. And the more he fought to hold on to control, the more it slipped from his hands. Darius prided himself on his image at work. To his colleagues, he was the man with the nice house, the pretty wife, the bright child. He carried himself with arrogance in meetings, the kind of confidence that only comes when a man knows his mask has never been questioned. But masks don't survive once the truth is dragged into the light. I knew from the beginning that his job was one of his most fragile weak points. His position wasn't secure enough to withstand scandal, and his company had a reputation for cutting ties at the first sign of liability. So, while the police and child protective services handled the legal side, I aimed for something more personal. His career. I gathered the photograph, the bank transfers, and the documentation of his secret child, stripped them of any identifying marks that would point back to me, and mailed them directly to his employer's HR department. I didn't include a letter. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. A man who beat his wife in front of his child, who bled her dry financially, who fathered a child outside marriage while living off another woman's paycheck. No company would want their name attached to him. It didn't take long. Within a week, Darius received notice of an internal review. His employer placed him on immediate suspension, pending investigation. The news spread quickly through his office. Colleagues who once laughed at his jokes now whispered in break rooms, passing around details they could hardly believe. The smirk he carried into every meeting vanished. No one wanted to sit with him at lunch. No one answered his calls after hours. His contracts, already precarious, began slipping away. Clients refused to work with him, citing personal concerns. Selah heard from a mutual acquaintance that he tried to defend himself, saying the picture was taken out of context, claiming his wife was exaggerating. But the photograph was too damning, too raw. It didn't matter what excuses he made. The image of his raised hand, the tears of his child, the laughter of his family, it sealed his reputation permanently. For a man like Darius, public image was everything. He didn't just crave control at home. He thrived on admiration outside it. He wanted to be seen as powerful, respected, untouchable. But now he walked into hallways filled with silence, colleagues shifting their eyes away, whispers buzzing just out of earshot. The same man who once strutted around boasting of his house and his life now couldn't even meet the gaze of his peers. At night he called Selah, his tone frantic. He begged her to retract her statements, to drop the reports, to fix the situation before it ruined him. When she refused, his begging turned to fury, threats spilling through the line. But even his threats carried less force now. He was unraveling and he knew it. For me, this wasn't just about destroying his career. It was about cutting off another avenue of control. Without his job, he couldn't fund his family's parasitism. Without his reputation, he couldn't hide behind the mask of respectability. Every collapse in his professional life was one less weapon he could wield against Selah. The fortress had already begun to crack in private. Now it was collapsing in public. His name, once spoken with admiration at work, was now synonymous with shame. Contracts evaporated. Promotions slipped away. Colleagues distanced themselves, afraid his scandal would taint their own careers. And for the first time, Darius experienced what it felt like to be powerless in a world he thought he controlled. His home wasn't his family wasn't loyal, his reputation wasn't intact, and now his career wasn't safe. I didn't celebrate when I heard he had been suspended. I didn't gloat when I learned contracts were being pulled. Instead, I sat quietly, remembering the night I had stood in his living room and whispered 3 words. "You are doomed." At the time, he thought it was a threat. Now it was becoming his reality. The downfall of Darius was never going to be his alone. From the moment I saw his parents and brother laughing in that living room, I knew they were as guilty as he was. Abuse doesn't survive in isolation. It thrives when others look away, or worse, when they join in. And now the law was catching up to them. The police investigation widened after Selah's testimony and the photograph were submitted. What began as a case of domestic violence evolved into something bigger. Conspiracy, financial fraud, and aiding and abetting. Officers didn't just see a husband lashing out. They saw a family culture that supported and enabled it. The photograph became critical again. It didn't just capture Darius's hand raised against his wife. It caught his parents on the couch, smiling. His brother filming the abuse like it was entertainment. That image, once burned into my mind, now became evidence of complicity. Soon, subpoenas began landing in their mailboxes. Darius's parents were called in for questioning. Investigators wanted to know why Selah's earnings had been funneled into their accounts under false pretenses. They wanted explanations for loans that never existed, for bills paid in Selah's name that had no connection to her household, and for the financial transfers tied to the woman raising Darius's child outside wedlock. Their smirks, once so smug, disappeared the moment officers sat across the table from them. His mother tried to play the role of the innocent grandmother, insisting she knew nothing of Darius's personal choices. But the paper trail said otherwise. Transfers marked with her signature appeared repeatedly in the records. Investigators confronted her with receipts, forcing her into silence. His father fared no better. For years he had leaned on Selah's income to cover his debts, dressing it up as family responsibility. Now, those debts were being scrutinized by forensic accountants, every dollar traced back to Selah's hard work. And then there was his brother, the one who held the phone that night. Detectives wanted to know why a grown man chose to record abuse instead of intervene. They asked whether the video was shared, whether it had been used as a threat to keep Selah quiet. For the first time, his cocky bravado collapsed. Under pressure, he admitted that the video existed, but he had deleted it to avoid trouble. That confession alone was damning. It showed awareness, intent to conceal, and participation in the cover-up. The walls of their family structure began to shake. Assets were frozen while investigations continued. Their bank accounts, once fattened by Selah's earnings, were suddenly under government review. Neighbors who once admired their supposed unity now gossiped about subpoenas and police cars parked outside their home. The laughter they once used to humiliate Selah was gone, replaced by tight lips and downcast eyes whenever they walked outside. For me, this wasn't just justice, it was balance. These were the same people who had mocked my daughter on her birthday, who had sat comfortably while violence unfolded, who had treated Selah's paycheck as their inheritance. They had thrived off her silence, believing no one would hold them accountable. But now the system had its eyes on them, and their arrogance was unraveling in real time. Selah watched from the sidelines, torn between disbelief and relief. "They really thought I would never stand up," she said one evening, her voice low. I told her the truth. That's what abusers count on, that you'll stay quiet. But once the silence is broken, they can't control what comes next. And what came next was devastating for them. Every subpoena, every interrogation, every asset investigation struck at the heart of their comfort. They had built their lives on her sacrifices, but with each legal blow, the foundation cracked wider. The fortress wasn't just crumbling around Darius. It was collapsing on the entire family that enabled him. The laughter in that living room, once meant to crush Selah's spirit, had instead become the evidence that crushed theirs. The day finally came when the evidence we had spent weeks compiling stepped out of binders and into the courtroom. It was no longer whispers in the neighborhood or quiet meetings with investigators. This was the public stage, the arena where truth and lies would be tested under oath. Darius entered the courtroom dressed in his finest suit, shoulders squared as if appearances could still save him. He carried the same arrogance he had always wielded, glancing toward Selah with a sneer that was meant to intimidate. But the weight of the charges against him hung heavy. Domestic abuse, financial exploitation, fraud, child endangerment. And now, with the DNA test confirmed, proof of infidelity and a secret child. From the opening statements, his defense was clear. Paint Selah as hysterical, vindictive, a woman scorned and coached by her mother to exaggerate. His lawyer leaned heavily into the image of a bitter wife determined to destroy her husband's life after a single argument. They tried to frame the photograph as a moment taken out of context. They suggested the bruises were old injuries. They even hinted that Selah had manipulated financial accounts to make her husband look guilty. But lies have a way of collapsing under evidence. The prosecution began with the photograph. Enlarged and mounted for the jury to see, it filled the room with silence. Every detail was undeniable. Darius's hand raised mid-strike, Selah recoiling, Ava's tears streaming down her face, and his family in the background laughing as if violence were sport. The jury didn't just see abuse. They saw cruelty endorsed by witnesses who should have protected her. Next came the bank records. Page after page showed withdrawals funneled into his family's accounts, loans signed under false pretenses, and suspicious payments to the mother of his secret child. The property deed was presented as well, proving the house belonged solely to Selah, dismantling Darius's claims of being the provider. Then came the DNA evidence. The experts spoke with precision, confirming what the documents already suggested. Darius had fathered another child during his marriage. The timeline matched, the payments aligned, and his parents' involvement was undeniable. Any remaining illusion of his respectability shattered in that moment. His family, sitting in the gallery, squirmed as the prosecution turned its attention to them. The photograph of them laughing became a weapon. Witnesses testified about their financial involvement, their encouragement of Darius's control, their silence in the face of abuse. His brother's admission of recording the assault and later deleting the video sealed the perception that this was not just a violent man, but a family that had enabled him. Through it all, Darius tried to hold his composure, but cracks showed. He whispered angrily to his lawyer, clenched his fists, shook his head as if disbelief could undo the evidence. When he finally took the stand, his arrogance turned into desperation. He claimed Selah was overly emotional, that she had made up stories because she resented his family. He said the secret child was a mistake, not proof of betrayal. But the more he spoke, the more his mask slipped. His temper flared, his contradictions mounted, and the jury could see the man beneath the facade. Selah, seated just a few feet away, held her head high. For the first time in years, she wasn't silent. She testified calmly, her voice steady as she described the abuse, the financial control, the humiliation, and the night her mother walked through the door with a cake and found her broken. Her words cut through the courtroom, and when paired with the evidence, they left no room for doubt. The trial stretched for days, but each one brought the same result, lie after lie crumbling under the weight of proof. The photograph, the bruises, the bank records, the DNA test. Every piece was a nail in the coffin of his defense. By the time closing arguments ended, the jury had seen enough. Darius was no longer the man he presented to the world. He was a husband who abused, a father who betrayed, and a son whose family joined in his deception. And in the courtroom where he thought charm and denial would save him, the truth had stripped him bare. The war was almost over. The verdict would come soon, and with it, the final collapse of the fortress he had built on lies. The courtroom was packed the morning the jury returned. You could feel the air shift as everyone filed in. Reporters, neighbors, even former colleagues of Darius who had come to witness the end of a man who had fooled them for years. Selah sat beside me, her hands trembling in her lap, but her back straight. Ava was not present. She was too young to see her father's fate sealed in public. When the foreperson stood, the silence was thick enough to choke on. The judge asked the question, and the answers came steady, one after another. On the charge of domestic abuse, guilty. On the charge of financial exploitation, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. Each word was a hammer blow, and with each blow, I saw the last traces of Darius's arrogance peel away. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened, but there was no more swagger left in him. The photograph, the bruises, the bank records, the DNA. All of it had done its work. The fortress of lies he had lived behind had crumbled completely. The judge wasted no time in sentencing. For the abuse and fraud, Darius was handed a lengthy prison term, one that would stretch across decades. The limited possibility of parole was a faint technicality, more symbolic than real. He would spend the best years of his life behind bars, stripped of the control he had once wielded so carelessly. His hands, which had struck Selah, would now be bound by the system he thought would never touch him. His family, once so bold, sat stone-faced as their own names were read aloud in connection with charges. While they escaped prison terms as severe as his, they faced their own punishments. Fines, asset seizures, and reputations destroyed. Investigators had proven their complicity in funneling Selah's earnings into fraudulent accounts. The home they had once lounged in so smugly was gone. Their finances, once buoyed by Selah's sacrifices, were gutted. What remained of their name was little more than ashes. For Selah, the verdict was both vindication and heartbreak. She had loved a man who betrayed her, defended him against her own mother, and paid dearly for it. To see him in chains, to watch his parents shrink under disgrace. It was justice, yes, but also a reminder of years she could never get back. I sat beside her as the gavel fell. It was the sound of an ending, the end of Darius's control, the end of his family's arrogance, the end of their laughter at her expense. And it was also the sound of a beginning, the first day Selah could step forward without fear of his hand or his shadow. As officers led him away, Darius turned his head one last time, his eyes meeting mine. For years, he had tried to intimidate me with smirks and words meant to silence. But in that final moment, there was nothing left in his gaze but emptiness. He remembered what I had said that night in his living room. You are doomed. And now it was no longer a warning. It was a sentence fulfilled. His parents shuffled out of the courtroom quietly, their heads lowered. Neighbors whispered as they passed, no longer admiring the family they once envied. Their fortress wasn't taken by fire or fury. It collapsed under the weight of truth, dragging all of them down together. Judgment had come. And with it, the life they had built on Selah's suffering was reduced to rubble. The weeks following the verdict brought a quiet unlike anything Selah had known in years. For the first time, she woke without fear of heavy footsteps in the hallway, without the sting of insults or the dread of raised hands. Instead, she woke in safety, with Ava's laughter filling the mornings and the certainty that Darius's shadow no longer reached her. The courts finalized what justice had begun. Selah was granted full and sole custody of Ava, a decision that came swiftly once the evidence of abuse and the environment of neglect in Darius's household were laid bare. No visitation rights, no shared authority, just freedom and safety for her daughter. It was a judgment that gave Selah not just legal power but peace of mind. But the greatest victory came with the house. That same home, the one where Selah had endured humiliation, where Darius had strutted as though it belonged to him, was restored completely to her name. The paperwork proved what had always been true. She had been the sole owner from the beginning. Now, without his presence or his family's grip, she could finally claim it openly. I still remember the day she walked back through the front door. The silence of the house was almost overwhelming. No mocking laughter. No demands. No intrusions. Just Selah, Ava, and me standing in the living room where her life had been torn apart. Selah set down her purse, took a deep breath, and said softly, "This is mine. It's really mine again." From that moment, she began the process of reclaiming more than walls and a roof. She painted over rooms that held memories of cruelty, furnished spaces to reflect her own taste, and created an environment where Ava could grow without fear. Every brushstroke, every piece of furniture moved, was an act of defiance against the years she had been made to feel like a tenant in her own life. Her ties to Darius's family were severed completely. Court orders barred them from contact, and Selah chose not to look back. The people who had mocked her, drained her finances, and laughed while she suffered were left to wrestle with their own disgrace. Their power over her was gone, and she had no intention of giving them another chance to steal her peace. And for me, after years of being cast aside, accused of doing too much, and told I was meddling, this was the moment my daughter finally saw me for what I had always been. Not an obstacle, not a burden, but her anchor. One evening, as Ava played quietly in her room, Selah sat across from me at the kitchen table and said the words I never thought I would hear. "Mama, I was wrong to push you away. You saved me. You saved us. I didn't need the apology. I didn't need the acknowledgement." But hearing it healed wounds I had carried silently for years. I reached across the table, squeezed her hand, and told her the truth. "That's what mothers do. Even when you don't want us there, we'll be standing behind you, ready when you need us." The road ahead wasn't simple. Healing never is. But Selah no longer walked it alone. She had her daughter by her side, her home secure, and her dignity intact. And for the first time in a long time she had me, not as a mother to battle against, but as the ally she had always needed. The house was restored. Her freedom was restored. And so, in many ways, was our relationship. What Darius and his family had tried to destroy had only made us stronger. Looking back, people often ask how I managed to face a man like Darius without fear. How I stood in that living room surrounded by his family and didn't back down. The truth is simple. I didn't need fists, and I didn't need shouting. My revenge was never about raising my hand or screaming for justice. It was about precision, strategy, letting the truth speak louder than any threat ever could. From the moment I walked into that house with a cake and flowers, my daughter's birthday turned into a battleground. But instead of fighting him on his terms, I fought him on mine. I documented. I gathered evidence. I built a trail so clear that even the lies he had lived behind for years couldn't cover it. Piece by piece I dismantled him. His marriage, his family's schemes, his career, his reputation. And I did it without losing myself. I never lowered myself to his cruelty. I never matched his violence with more violence. Instead, I showed him something far more terrifying. The unstoppable will of a mother determined to protect her child and grandchild. Selah is safe now. Ava is growing up in a home filled with peace instead of fear. The house that once felt like a prison is once again a sanctuary, and my daughter walks with her head high, no longer chained by silence or shame. The fortress that Darius and his family built out of lies, manipulation, and arrogance has collapsed into dust. But for me, the most powerful part of this story isn't in the court verdicts or the seized assets. It's in the echo of a single moment. That night, in the middle of his laughter in front of his family, I looked Darius in the eye and spoke 3 words. "You are doomed." He laughed then. He thought it was nothing, just an old woman's empty threat. But those words were prophecy. They marked the beginning of the end. From that moment on, his downfall was inevitable. Every step he took afterward only led him closer to the edge. And when the gavel finally fell, when the sentence was handed down, when his parents walked out of the courtroom disgraced, I remembered the silence in that living room after I spoke those words. How the laughter died. How the air shifted. How, for the first time, he realized he wasn't untouchable. Darius never recovered. Not from the truth, not from the evidence, not from the words I planted in his mind that night. His hands, once used to strike fear, are now shackled. His name, once spoken with pride, is now a warning. His family, once arrogant, is left with nothing but shame. And so, in the end, revenge was fulfilled. Not with rage, not with blood, but with the quiet, steady destruction of everything he built on lies. Because sometimes, all it takes to end a man's empire is one photograph, one strategy, and 3 words he will never forget. You are doomed.